The dog didn't bark. That was the part nobody could explain afterward. 7 German shepherds, each one trained to hold position under gunfire, to ignore distractions, to follow the hand of their handler and no one else, stood at perfect attention along the west steps of the Brampton War Memorial. It was the kind of late September morning that Ontario does better than anywhere else on Earth. The sky a cold, clean blue, the maples just beginning to let go of their color, red and amber leaves catching in the gutters along Queen Street. Families had gathered in clusters along the roped perimeter. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. A color guard from the 32nd Canadian Brigade stood at the top of the steps in pressed dress uniforms. Reporters from the Brampton Guardian and 2 Toronto affiliates held cameras at their shoulders. Nobody was looking at the woman near the fountain. She was standing maybe 30 feet back from the K9 unit, just inside the public area, wearing a canvas work jacket the color of old wheat. She wasn't in uniform. She didn't carry a flag or a wreath. She had her hands pushed into her pockets, and she was watching the dogs with an expression that, if anyone had thought to study it, wasn't the casual curiosity of a bystander. It was something older than that, something held back. Her name was Hailey Drummond. She was 29 years old, and until 14 months ago, she had raised every single one of those dogs from a pup. The ceremony had been organized by Constable Brendan Walsh of the Peel Regional Police K9 unit, a square-shouldered man with the kind of careful efficiency that comes from spending a decade working alongside animals that can smell feefear from 60 meters. Walsh had coordinated the event to honor 3 handlers who had retired that autumn, and the unit wanted the dogs present, wanted the public to see what these animals had become. Disciplined, decorated, dependable. He stood at the far left of the formation now, holding the lead of a dog named Atlas, a 4-year-old shepherd with a dark saddle and amber eyes that swept the crowd in steady, unhurried arcs. Atlas was exceptional. Every handler in the unit said so. He had the kind of focus that made senior trainers go quiet. What Brendan Walsh did not know, what none of the handlers standing on those steps knew, was that Atlas had learned to sit on a hand signal, not a voice command when he was 11 weeks old, that he'd been taught to track by a young woman who walked him barefoot through the grass behind a rented farmhouse in Caledon so he could learn the difference between a trail laid on cold ground and one laid on warm, that his first real find, a lost child, a 6-year-old girl named Amber Peach, who had wandered from a trail at Heart Lake Conservation Area, had been worked by that same woman on a frozen Tuesday in February, 2 years before any police unit had ever seen his name on a file. Hailey Drummond had done all of that, and then the dogs had been taken from her. And now she was standing near a fountain at a public memorial, watching them wear another unit's badges and trying very hard to keep her face still. She hadn't planned to come. She'd driven up from Guelph that morning because her younger brother Theo had texted her the night before, said he'd seen something on the Peel Regional website that she needed to see. She'd ignored the text until 6:30 in the morning when she was standing in her kitchen in yesterday's clothes, drinking coffee that had gone cold, and she'd finally opened the link. There was a photograph, 7 dogs lined up on the memorial steps in the preview image. She hadn't even needed to read the caption. She had recognized Atlas by the way he held his left ear, 1 centimeter lower than the right, since a minor infection the previous spring. She had recognized Sable by the white blaze on her chest that the breeder had almost used to disqualify her. She had recognized Cole, who stood a half-shoulder taller than every other dog in the unit, and had a habit, when he was tracking something strong, of dropping his head so low his chin nearly brushed the ground. She had set the coffee down on the counter. She had stood there for a long time. Then she had gotten in her truck and driven. She didn't call anyone. She didn't tell her brother. She didn't know what she was going to do when she got there. She just drove north on the 401, watching the city give way to suburbs, watching the suburbs thin into the clean flat fields of Peel Region, and she told herself she would just stand at the back and watch, and then go home. Hailey had started working with dogs at 17, not because anyone had suggested it, and not because it had seemed like a career path. Her family had a property outside Orangeville. Her father grew corn and kept a small hay operation. Her mother taught grade 4 at the local elementary school, and they had always had dogs. But Hailey's relationship with them was different from the beginning, and the people around her noticed it without being able to name what they were seeing. It wasn't just that the dogs liked her, it was that they paid attention to her. They watched her the way dogs only watch someone they have fully, unconditionally decided to trust. By the time she was 20, she was driving 2 hours south every weekend to apprentice with a retired RCMP trainer named Gerald Oak, who ran a small facility outside Campbellville. Gerald was 71, spare and careful with words, and he had trained working dogs for 34 years. He looked at Hailey during their first session, watched her spend 40 minutes with a young shepherd who had been washed out of 3 previous training programs for what the intake forms called reactivity issues. And then he poured 2 cups of coffee and told her to come back the following Saturday. She came back every Saturday for 3 years. What Gerald taught her, or rather, what he showed her the shape of, because this was knowledge you could only trace with your hands, was that the dogs other trainers called difficult were almost never actually difficult. They were dogs that had been taught to be confused. They had been given inconsistent signals, conflicting expectations, the kind of pressure that didn't make sense from the animal's point of view. When you took that pressure away and replaced it with clarity, most of them came right. Not all, but most. She started her own operation when she was 23. She rented a property in Caledon, 12 acres, a converted barn, a long field that backed onto the Humber River headwaters. She called it Drummond Working Dogs. She took 2 clients in the first year. By the 3rd year, she had a waiting list. The dogs she bred and trained went to search and rescue teams, to police units across southern Ontario, to one handler in the Canadian Armed Forces who had found her through a contact at Borden and who had written her a handwritten thank you note after his dog completed its first operational deployment. She kept files on every dog she'd ever placed. She knew their names, their temperaments, their quirks. She knew that Atlas was afraid of the sound of plastic tarps in the wind. She knew that Sable didn't like being approached from the left in low light. She knew that Cole needed to be first out of the crate, or he'd spiral into himself and take 3 days to come back. She knew them the way you know something you built with your own hands in a room by yourself. The theft had happened on a Wednesday. Hailey had driven into Brampton for a supply run, feed, a replacement latch for the kennel gate, a vet appointment for a young female named Birch who had been limping slightly on her rear right. She had been gone for 6 hours. When she came back, the property was quiet in the wrong way. She had stood at the end of the driveway for almost a full minute, the truck idling, before she understood what the silence meant. The kennel gate was standing open. All 8 runs were empty. The water bowls were still full. Whoever had done it had worked fast, and they had known the layout, which told her something she didn't want to think about yet. She called the Wellington County OPP from her driveway. She called Gerald. She sat down on the gravel in her work boots and her barn jacket with the torn left cuff, and she put her hands on her knees and she breathed 11 dogs. She had 11 dogs on the property that day. They were all gone. The investigation was slow in the way that theft cases involving animals are always slow, because the law in Canada still treats animals as property, and stolen property below a certain threshold doesn't generate the kind of resources that stolen people do. Hailey understood this. She didn't rage about it, though the people around her half expected her to. She filed her reports. She provided microchip numbers, registration documents, training records. She contacted every police unit, every rescue organization, every dog sport club in a 4-province radius. She posted on every working dog forum she could find. She heard nothing for 6 weeks. Then a retired OPP officer named Hugh Carmichael, who had followed the case because he recognized 3 of the dogs from a training seminar he'd attended 2 years prior, made a call to a contact in Peel region who was seeing an unusual number of high-quality trained shepherds come through the black market. It was a slow, lateral kind of detective work, the kind that doesn't make the news because it happens between coffee and paperwork, one quiet conversation at a time. The man they eventually connected to the theft was a broker. Not someone who worked with dogs himself, but someone who knew how to move them between provinces, how to strip their microchips and alter their registration paperwork, how to place them with buyers who didn't ask too many questions. His name was Kevin Breyer, and when the charges were finally laid, they covered 11 counts of theft over $5,000, trafficking in property obtained by crime, and breach of a court order from a previous conviction. Hailey learned about the arrest from Hugh Carmichael, who called her on a Thursday evening and told her as gently as he could that 7 of the 11 dogs had been recovered. The other 4 had been moved to buyers outside Canada and could not at this stage be traced. She had thanked him. She had hung up the phone. She had gone out to her empty kennel and sat in the space where Atlas's run used to be, and she had stayed there for a long time without moving. 7 dogs were recovered, but they weren't returned to Hailey. This was the part that sat wrong with everyone who heard the story later. And it's important to understand how it happened, because it didn't happen out of cruelty. It happened out of process. The dogs had been sold, in the months between their theft and their recovery, to 2 municipal police services and 1 provincial contract training operation. By the time Kevin Breyer was charged, the dogs had been in active service for between 4 and 8 months. They had new handlers, they had operational histories, they had files. The services that held them had paid market value, legitimate market value, to the broker, not knowing the animals were stolen. When the title dispute went to civil process, the legal determination was that the dogs could remain with their current placements. Given the public safety interest in maintaining working partnerships, and that Hailey would be compensated financially for the loss. The compensation was fair by any measure that didn't include the fact that money was not the point. She didn't contest it. Her lawyer told her she could, that there was a reasonable argument to be made. But she sat in the office on the 7th floor of a building on King Street West in Toronto, and she looked at the settlement figure on the page in front of her, and she thought about the dogs, about what it would mean to pull them out of active service and put them through another transition, and she said no. She said she'd sign. She signed in October. She got her check in November. She used part of it to renovate the kennel and start over with 2 new pups. She did not go back to Brampton until September, until a grey morning and a cold blue sky and a row of 7 German shepherds lined up on stone steps in the sharp autumn light, and Hailey Drummond standing 30 feet back with her hands in her pockets, watching Atlas hold his left ear 1 centimeter lower than the right. The ceremony had been going on for about 20 minutes when it happened. The colour guard had stepped forward. The speeches had begun. Constable Walsh was standing at attention at the far left of the K9 line, and the handlers were all watching the speaker at the podium, as they'd been instructed, maintaining the professional composure that these events require. The dogs were watching too, or rather they were doing what trained working dogs do, which is watch everything at once, their attention spread evenly across the crowd, the way light spreads across water. And then Atlas turned his head. It was a small movement, just a few degrees, nothing that would read as anything other than routine scanning to anyone who wasn't watching closely. But the dog's whole body changed when he turned. The alertness in his ears, the quality of his attention, it shifted, it focused, it became something specific. He had caught a scent, not a threat scent. Working dogs are trained to signal threat differently, a stiffening, a pulling forward, a particular quality of frozen attention. This was something else. This was the kind of response you see when a dog finds something it has been, somewhere below the level of training, looking for without knowing it was looking. Atlas made a sound in his throat. Not a bark, barely even a whine, more like a syllable of something that had been held too long. Walsh looked down at him, frowning, thinking the dog was reacting to something in the crowd. Maybe a food smell, maybe an animal. He tightened his grip on the lead and gave the hand signal for steady. Atlas didn't look at him. He was looking at the woman near the fountain. What happened next took about 12 seconds, and people at the ceremony described it differently, depending on where they were standing. Some said the dogs moved almost simultaneously. Some said Atlas went first, and the others followed. The reporters said there was an audible sound from the crowd, a collective intake of breath, or maybe a gasp, the kind of sound a group of people makes when something breaks the pattern of what they expected to see. All 7 dogs broke toward the fountain, not in a frenzied way, not snarling, not lunging. They went in the direction their instincts had apparently all agreed on at the same moment, with a purpose that looked, to the people watching, almost deliberate. The handlers, Brendan Walsh, Constable Yuki Tanaka, Officer Darius Fleming, Sergeant Nadia Borg, and the 3 others held their leads and leaned back against the pull, and for a moment there was a kind of ridiculous tug-of-war happening at the top of the memorial steps while the speaker at the podium stopped mid-sentence and the color guard shifted their weight and the cameras all swung left. A security officer near the fountain stepped toward the woman. His hand went up. Ma'am, I need you to." She had already crouched down. She hadn't decided to do it. Her knees had just bent, the way a body does when it knows what's coming before the mind has caught up. Her hands came out of her pockets, and then Atlas reached her. Walsh had loosened his grip for just a second, maybe because he understood that fighting this was going to make it worse, or maybe because Atlas's pull had simply become too strong to hold against, and the dog put his head directly under her chin and stayed there, trembling, not shaking from fear, trembling the way a voice trembles when it's trying not to break. Sable arrived a breath later, then Cole, his big head dropping low and then lifting to push against her shoulder. Then the others, one by one, until Hailey Drummond was kneeling on the stone ground of the Brampton War Memorial, with 7 German shepherds around her, and her arms around as many of them as her arms could reach, and she wasn't trying to keep her face still anymore. The handlers arrived. Walsh came forward first, lead in hand, and he looked down at this woman he'd never seen before, surrounded by his dogs, and he said, quietly, because the microphones at the podium were still live, "Who are you?" She looked up at him. Her eyes were red. There were tear tracks on both cheeks, and she didn't seem to care. "I raised them," she said. "All of them." Walsh stood there for a moment. He looked at Atlas, who had not moved, whose whole body was still turned toward this woman like a compass finding north after a long time of spinning. He looked at Cole. He looked at Sable. Then he looked back at Hailey. He crouched down beside her. "Tell me," he said. They stood down the formal portion of the ceremony by about 15 minutes. The MC explained to the crowd that there had been an unexpected development, that the organizers needed a moment to address. And the crowd, because crowds can read a room even when they don't have the full information, didn't push back. They waited. Some of them had already taken out their phones. Walsh sat with Hailey on the steps while a junior officer brought them both coffee from the reception table. He listened without interrupting while she talked, which is a skill not everyone has, and which Hailey would remember later as the thing she was most grateful for. She told him about Caledon. She told him about Gerald Oak and the Campbellville facility. She told him about the Wednesday. She came home from Brampton to an empty kennel. She told him about Hugh Carmichael, about Kevin Breyer, about the settlement figure on the page in King Street West. Walsh's expression didn't change much while she spoke. He was the kind of person whose face had learned to stay, even when the inside wasn't. But at one point, when she got to the part about Atlas, about how she'd spent 3 weeks working him on night, tracking in the Humber Headwar waters before he was ready to run a real trail, something crossed his face that she caught and held. He had a daughter, he told her. She was 3. She was obsessed with the unit dogs. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. Sergeant Nadia Borg was the one who suggested the demonstration. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s, with 21 years in the service, and the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to announce itself. And she had been standing off to the side, listening to Hailey's account, with her arms crossed and her eyes moving between the dogs and the woman, with an expression that was measuring something. When Walsh reached a pause, she looked at Hailey. "Can you still work them?" Hailey looked at her. "I mean right now," Borg said. "Can you handle them?" What Hailey did then was something she hadn't done in 14 months. She looked at the dogs, at Atlas first, who was still leaning against her left knee, and she made a slow, flat gesture with her right hand, a signal she had built herself, not part of any standard obedience protocol, a signal that meant, "Sit square, watch me, wait." All 7 dogs sat, not one after the other. All at once, the handlers looked at each other. Walsh let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. Borg nodded. "Come on," she said. "There are about 300 people out there who need to see this." The second part of the ceremony wasn't in the program. Nadia Borg walked to the podium and spoke for about 2 minutes. She told the crowd that the unit had an unexpected guest, someone whose contribution to the K9 program had gone unrecognized, someone the dogs themselves had recognized when their handlers could not. She kept it factual. She didn't oversell it. She was a good speaker, precisely because she seemed entirely uninterested in being a good speaker. Then she stepped back, and Hailey Drummond walked forward with 7 German shepherds at her side. She moved them through a sequence for maybe 5 minutes. Not the full routine she would have run in her prime, but enough. Enough to show what the connection looked like from the outside, the unhurried authority of it, the absence of any of the tension you normally see between a working dog and a handler who doesn't have the animal's full trust. The dogs watched her hands. They watched her weight shifts. They went left when she canted left, dropped when she lowered her chin, held when she stilled. Cole tracked a scent article she'd held in her bare hand across 50 feet of plaza and came back to her without a word spoken. The crowd was very quiet, not the quiet of people who are being polite, the quiet of people who are watching something that is true. Walsh found her afterward, when the crowd had thinned and the media had gotten their footage, and the reception table was running low on the small sandwiches that someone's auxiliary had made at 5 in the morning. He asked her what she was doing next. She told him she was driving back to Guelph, that she had 2 young dogs to feed before dark. He said he had a request. It wasn't an offer in the formal sense. He was clear about that. This was not the kind of thing he could arrange himself, and it would need to go through channels he couldn't predict. But he wanted to know if she'd be willing to sit down with the unit's training supervisor, not to reclaim the dogs. That wasn't possible, and he knew she knew that. But the Peel Service was developing a new intake process for selecting pups for the K9 program. They kept washing out candidates 2 years in, at great expense, because the early assessment wasn't sensitive enough. He thought she might be able to help them build something better. He had seen, in 5 minutes on those steps, what it had taken him 3 years in the unit to begin to understand. Hailey stood with a paper cup of cooling coffee, and she looked at the memorial behind him, the stone faces, the bronze lettering, the maple leaves caught in the joints of the stonework, and she thought about the empty runs in Caledon, and about the 4 dogs she would never find, and about the 2 pups waiting for her in Guelph, who were 12 weeks old and hadn't become anything yet. "All right," she said. "Set the meeting." Walsh nodded. He held out his hand, and she shook it. Behind him, across the emptying plaza, Atlas was sitting beside his crate at the transport van. He had turned his head back toward the fountain. He was watching the place where she had been. He sat there for a long time before his handler finally called him in.